Imagine standing at the edge of your life. Looking back, would you see a path lined with joy, purpose, and deep connection? Or would you see years spent chasing things that never truly mattered? The reality is, most of us spend our best years running after status, wealth, recognition, only to realize, much too late, that we were running in the wrong direction. We convince ourselves that happiness lies just beyond the next promotion, the next milestone, the next purchase. But time has a way of unraveling illusions, and one day we wake up and see that the things we once deemed urgent, climbing the corporate ladder, proving ourselves to others, amassing possessions, were nothing more than fleeting distractions. The real treasures of life. They were always there, waiting for us to notice: the warmth of a shared laugh, the peace of a quiet morning, the love of those who walked beside us all along. But here's the thing. What if we didn't have to wait until the later years of our lives to learn these truths? What if we could recognize them now, while we still have time to change course, to live differently, to make choices that lead to fulfillment instead of regret? That's what we're here to explore. Through the lens of Buddhist philosophy, we will uncover 9 profound realizations, lessons that, when embraced early, can reshape our lives in the most extraordinary ways. This is your wake-up call, because the greatest tragedy isn't growing old, it's reaching the end of your journey and realizing you never truly lived. 1. The illusion of status. For much of life, we chase after titles, promotions, and social recognition. We tell ourselves that success will bring fulfillment, that once we reach a certain level, we will finally be at peace. But the closer we get, the further the goalpost moves. We spend decades proving our worth, convinced that our identity is tied to our position in society. But then something shifts. Retirement strips away professional identity. The world moves on, replacing us with younger, more ambitious individuals. The accolades that once seemed monumental now gather dust in forgotten corners. And in this moment of quiet, a realization dawns. Status was never the true measure of a life well lived. Buddhism teaches us that attachment to impermanent things leads to suffering. The pursuit of status is a game that cannot be won, because the prize itself is an illusion. The real legacy we leave behind is not in titles or accomplishments, but in the lives we touch, the kindness we show, and the wisdom we share. There was once a businessman named Robert who had spent his entire life climbing the corporate ladder. He started from the bottom, worked long nights, sacrificed holidays, and devoted his every waking moment to securing his place among the elite. By his late 50s, he had done it. He was the CEO of a major company, respected and feared in equal measure. His name carried weight in boardrooms, his presence commanded attention, and his words shaped the future of industries. But then the inevitable happened: retirement. The company he had built his identity around thanked him for his service, presented him with a commemorative plaque, and swiftly moved forward with his replacement. At first, Robert struggled to adjust. He still dressed in his tailored suits, expecting invitations, phone calls, and the rush of decision-making. But the world had already turned its gaze elsewhere. His importance, so deeply intertwined with his job, evaporated almost overnight. It was during this time of confusion and loss that he stumbled upon a small Buddhist temple near his home. Out of curiosity, perhaps desperation, he began attending the morning meditations. Day by day, he listened to the monks speak of impermanence, of letting go, of finding meaning beyond external validation. And one morning, as he swept the temple courtyard alongside an elderly monk, the realization struck him. His worth had never been in his title. It had never been in the power he wielded. It had always been in how he treated others, in the wisdom he shared, in the small moments of kindness that had once seemed insignificant compared to his grand ambitions. One of the monks, sensing his newfound understanding, smiled and told him a story. There was once a great scholar who built an enormous library, believing that knowledge was his legacy. But when he passed away, the books crumbled and his name was forgotten. The true legacy is not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away. From that day forward, Robert changed. He stopped introducing himself as former CEO and instead became a mentor for young professionals, guiding them not toward status, but toward purpose. He spent time with his family in ways he never had before, cherishing laughter over prestige. He realized that status had been a mirage, luring him forward, but never offering real fulfillment. It was in surrendering to the present, in embracing the fleeting nature of recognition, that he finally found peace. True success is not measured by titles or influence, but by the depth of one's inner contentment. A monk sweeping leaves in a quiet monastery may hold more wisdom than the most powerful executive. The moment we stop chasing status and start nurturing the richness of our souls, we step onto the path of true fulfillment. 2. The freedom from others' opinions. How many of our choices have been dictated by the fear of judgment? From childhood, we are conditioned to seek approval from parents, teachers, peers, and society at large. We hesitate before speaking our minds, hold back our dreams, and shape our lives around what is deemed acceptable. But by 70, we see the absurdity of it all. The opinions that once terrified us no longer hold power. The people we tried so hard to impress are either preoccupied with their own struggles or have faded from our lives entirely. And then it hits us. Most people were never truly thinking about us in the first place. They too were caught in their own web of worries and self-doubt. In the Buddhist tradition, the concept of anatta, the notion of no fixed self, reminds us that our identity is not defined by external perceptions. True freedom comes when we stop seeking validation and start living authentically. There was once a man named Thomas who had spent his entire life playing the role others expected of him. As a child, he was the obedient son, excelling in school because it pleased his parents. As a young man, he pursued a career in law, not because he loved it, but because society admired it. And as he grew older, he carefully curated every aspect of his life, his clothes, his house, his friendships, to project an image of success. But something never felt quite right. Then, one day in his late 60s, Thomas attended a high school reunion. At first, he was eager to impress, slipping into his well-rehearsed persona of achievement. But as the evening wore on, he began to notice something striking. No one seemed particularly interested in his carefully constructed success story. Some barely remembered him, while others were too absorbed in sharing their own worries about retirement, health, and their own unrealized dreams. That night, as he drove home, it hit him like a thunderbolt. He had spent his entire life shaping himself around the expectations of people who were never truly paying attention. The years of hesitation, of doubting himself, of conforming, suddenly felt like a tragic waste. Not long after, Thomas made a radical decision. He quit the board memberships he had never enjoyed, sold his house, and moved to a small coastal town. He took up woodworking, something he had secretly loved as a child, but abandoned for fear that it wasn't prestigious enough. He spent his days carving intricate figures, not for profit, not for recognition, but for the sheer joy of creation. One afternoon, a young traveler passing through the town admired his work and asked if he was a famous sculptor. Thomas simply smiled and said, "I used to be a lawyer, but that was someone else's dream, not mine. This is who I really am." And for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. True freedom is not found in approval, but in authenticity. Imagine an elderly woman, her hands stained with paint, lost in the joy of creation, unconcerned with whether anyone thinks her art is good or not. That is the kind of liberation we should all strive for, the kind that allows us to embrace life fully, without the weight of expectation pulling us down. 3. The pointlessness of holding grudges. Resentment feels justified in the moment. When we are wronged, our anger becomes a shield, a way to protect ourselves from further harm. But what we fail to see is that the grudge does not imprison the other person. It imprisons us. Time that could be spent in peace is wasted replaying old wounds. Energy that could be used for creation and connection is drained by bitterness. By 70, the weight of resentment becomes undeniable. The people we once held anger toward have moved on, changed, or disappeared from our lives entirely. And then we see the painful truth. Holding on to pain only ensured that the past continued to control our present. Buddhism teaches that forgiveness is not about excusing bad behavior. It is about releasing ourselves from suffering. The Buddha himself once said, "Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned." There was once a man named George, a retired school principal, who carried a heavy burden in his heart. Decades earlier, he had been betrayed by a close friend, a fellow teacher whom he had trusted implicitly. The betrayal was personal, cutting deep into the fabric of their friendship. And George had vowed never to forgive him. For years he clung to that anger, replaying the moment over and over in his mind, like an old, worn-out film. Whenever the man's name was mentioned, his stomach would tighten and bitterness would rise like bile in his throat. Even as he built a successful career, raised a loving family, and entered his later years, the grudge remained, a dark shadow following him through every milestone. One day, while sitting alone on his porch, George overheard his grandson playing with his friends. A minor argument had erupted, and in a burst of frustration, his grandson shouted, "I'll never forgive you." Something about those words struck George to his core. He saw his own anger reflected in the child's face. The same rigid refusal to let go, the same weight pressing down on a youthful heart. Later that evening, he sat his grandson down and told him a story about a foolish old man who had spent his entire life carrying a heavy sack filled with stones. Each stone represented a past hurt, an injustice, a slight. The man refused to set the sack down, convinced that holding on to it would somehow make things right. But as the years passed, the weight of the sack only grew heavier, and the man's back became bent, his spirit weary. And one day, in his final moments, he realized the truth. He had wasted his entire life carrying a burden that he could have set down at any time. His grandson, wide-eyed, asked, "What happened to the old man?" George smiled sadly. He realized it too late. But we don't have to make the same mistake. That night, George picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized, but never used. The voice on the other end was older, softer, unfamiliar, yet deeply familiar. And in that moment, George did something he never thought he would do. He let go. He forgave. And for the first time in decades, the weight lifted. He felt lighter, as if he had just set down a sack of stones he had been carrying for far too long. Forgiveness is not for the other person, it is for ourselves. It is the key that unlocks the prison we build with our own hands, the act that frees us from the past and allows us to truly live in the present. Picture an elderly woman standing at the ocean's edge, watching as the tide carries away a message she had written in the sand, words of anger and resentment, now washed clean by the waves. That is the power of letting go. That is the liberation of forgiveness. 4. The emptiness of material possessions. For years we accumulate bigger houses, luxury cars, the latest gadgets, convinced that success is measured by what we own. Each new possession brings a temporary thrill, but soon the desire shifts to something else, fueling an endless cycle of consumption. But by 70, the illusion begins to crumble. The once prized objects lose their charm. The grand house feels empty. The expensive clothes sit untouched. And what remains? The experiences, the laughter shared with loved ones, the impact we had on others. There was a man named Henry who had spent his life building wealth. As a young man, he had been poor, and he promised himself that he would never feel the sting of scarcity again. He worked tirelessly, making sacrifices, skipping vacations, and putting off simple joys in favor of accumulating more. By the time he was 50, he had everything society deemed impressive: a sprawling mansion, a garage filled with luxury cars, and a bank account that could sustain him for several lifetimes. Yet, despite it all, an emptiness gnawed at him. One afternoon, Henry visited an old friend, Samuel, who had chosen a vastly different path. Samuel had been a school teacher, never wealthy but always content. His home was modest, his belongings few, but his life was rich with friendships, stories, and laughter. As they sat together drinking tea, Henry found himself staring at a faded, well-worn armchair in the corner. "That chair has seen more joy than any of my possessions ever will," Samuel chuckled, noticing Henry's gaze. "My grandchildren sit there while I tell them stories. My wife used to sit there every evening, knitting and humming old songs. My friends have cried and laughed in that chair. It's just an old piece of furniture, but to me, it holds more value than all the gold in the world." That night, Henry walked through his grand estate, and for the first time, truly saw it. The towering walls, the pristine furniture, the rooms filled with expensive decor, yet there was no warmth, no life. It was a museum of his achievements, but it was not a home. Years passed, and as Henry aged, he began to let go. He sold his mansion and moved into a smaller house, one where his children and grandchildren felt comfortable visiting often. He gave away much of his wealth, using it to fund scholarships, support community projects, and help those in need. And in that giving, he found something he had never experienced before: true joy. In Buddhism, the concept of impermanence teaches that everything is fleeting. Material things may bring temporary pleasure, but they will never offer lasting fulfillment. What remains at the end of life is not what we owned, but how we lived, who we loved, and the kindness we shared. Imagine an elderly woman standing in a small, cluttered kitchen, stirring a pot of soup while her grandchildren chatter around her. She has no diamonds, no designer clothes, no flashy possessions, but she is wealthy in the ways that matter: in love, in memories, in moments. That is the only kind of richness that lasts. 5. The trap of perfectionism. Perfectionism is a seductive illusion. We tell ourselves that once conditions are perfect, we will finally take action, start a business, write that book, tell someone how we feel. But as the years pass, we realize that perfection never arrives. Buddhism teaches the beauty of imperfection. Life was never meant to be flawless. It was meant to be lived. The greatest memories, the deepest connections, and the most meaningful experiences all come from embracing the imperfect moments. Eleanor had spent her entire life waiting for the right moment. As a child, she hesitated before joining games, afraid she wouldn't be good enough. As a young woman, she postponed writing her novel, convinced that she needed just a little more knowledge, just a little more time. She watched opportunities slip through her fingers, always believing she'd catch the next one when she was ready. By the time Eleanor reached her 70s, she had a drawer full of unfinished manuscripts, a heart full of unspoken words, and a lifetime of moments she had let pass by. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching a storm roll in, she thought of an old friend who had always wanted to travel. He had dreamed of visiting Italy, of walking through the streets of Rome, of standing beneath the Sistine Chapel. But he had always said, maybe next year, and then one day, next year never came. That night, something in Eleanor shifted. She walked to her desk, pulled out a half-written story she had abandoned years ago, and began to write. Not perfectly, not with any grand expectation, just for the sheer joy of it. And for the first time in decades, she felt truly alive. Weeks later, her granddaughter invited her to dance at a family gathering. Normally, Eleanor would have waved her off, insisting she was too old, too stiff, too out of practice. But this time, she thought of all the time she had waited for perfection. She stood, took her granddaughter's hand, and stepped onto the dance floor. She stumbled, she laughed, and in that moment, she was not just existing, she was living. The truth is, perfection is a mirage. It keeps us waiting, hesitating, watching life, instead of engaging with it. We convince ourselves that we need more time, more skill, more certainty, but all we ever really need is the courage to begin. In Zen Buddhism, there is a concept called wabi-sabi, the acceptance of transience and imperfection. A cracked teacup, an asymmetrical painting, the tremble in a voice singing a song. These things are beautiful because they are real, because they exist in their imperfect, fleeting nature. Imagine an artist staring at a blank canvas, brush in hand, too afraid to make the first stroke for fear of ruining it. Now imagine another artist who, with reckless joy, lets the paint flow freely, embracing each unexpected splash as part of the masterpiece. Who, in the end, has created something of true value? Perfectionism steals our time, our joy, our chance to fully experience life. The lesson: stop waiting. Life is happening now. 6. The fleeting nature of time. We always assume there will be more time to chase dreams, to reconnect with loved ones, to start fresh. But by 70, we realize time was never guaranteed. The chances we thought would always be there have disappeared. The people we intended to spend time with are gone. There was a man named Arthur who had spent his entire life believing he had time. As a young man, he dreamed of playing the piano, of composing a song that captured the emotions he could never quite put into words. But there was always something else demanding his attention: his job, his responsibilities, the belief that one day he would have the time to dedicate to music. "I'll start next year," he would tell himself. But next year became the year after. And then another and another. Decades passed, and Arthur found himself at 75, staring at an old upright piano in his living room, one that had sat untouched for years, collecting dust. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly with age. He sighed, knowing that his fingers were no longer as nimble as they once were. Regret settled into his bones. The time he had once thought so abundant was now slipping through his grasp, like sand through an open palm. One evening, his granddaughter came to visit. She had taken up the violin and spoke excitedly about music, how it made her feel alive, how every note told a story. Arthur listened, a bittersweet smile on his lips. She asked him if he had ever played an instrument, and for the first time in years he admitted his old dream. "Then why don't you start now, Grandpa?" she asked, tilting her head in curiosity. Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm too old for that now. My hands aren't what they used to be. But his granddaughter, with all the innocence and wisdom of youth, simply shrugged. So you still have today. That night, long after his granddaughter had left, Arthur sat at the piano, running his fingers over the keys. Tentatively he pressed one down. A single note echoed through the room. Then another, and another. It was slow, clumsy, nothing like the melodies he had once imagined. But it was something, and as he played he realized he still had time, at least for this moment. Buddhism teaches us the concept of impermanence, that everything, including time, is constantly changing, slipping away. We are never promised another day, another chance. The future is not something we can bank on. It is only the present that we truly own. Imagine an old woman sitting by the window, watching the rain fall. She thinks of a letter she always meant to send to an old friend, a reconciliation she never made, a trip she always postponed. But time has moved forward, indifferent to her regrets. The friend is gone, the moment passed, and all that remains is the aching realization that she waited too long. We believe we have time, but the truth is we don't know how much of it we have left. We say we will call someone tomorrow, that we will visit a place we love someday. But someday is not a guarantee, it is a gamble. And too often we realize the urgency of time only when it's too late. So let's stop waiting. Let's say what we need to say now. Let's chase what sets our hearts on fire today. Because in the end, the only time we ever truly have is this very moment. 7. Health is the real wealth. We neglect our bodies in pursuit of ambition, responsibilities, and daily distractions. But by 70, the consequences are undeniable. Strength fades, energy declines, simple tasks become challenges. Richard had spent his life building his business. Late nights at the office, endless meetings, fast food eaten on the go. He told himself he was sacrificing for a better future. There was always another deal to close, another milestone to reach. I'll start taking care of myself when things settle down, he often thought, but things never settled down. At 72, Richard sat in his doctor's office, listening to the words he had feared but somehow expected. His heart was weak. His blood pressure was out of control. The body that had once carried him tirelessly through decades of work was now failing him. And it hit him. He had spent years accumulating wealth, but in the process, he had bankrupted his health. "Can I fix this?" he asked. Voice laced with regret, the doctor sighed, offering a small, sympathetic smile. "You can slow it down. You can make the best of what you have left. But Richard, time is not something we can rewind." That night, he sat alone in his grand home, a place he had once dreamed of owning. The silence was deafening. The luxury meant little when his legs ached from a simple walk to the kitchen. The fine wine in his cellar held no appeal when his body rejected indulgence. He realized that all the success, all the wealth, all the accolades, none of it could give him back what he had lost. Buddhism teaches us the principle of mindfulness of the body, the understanding that our physical form is impermanent, fragile, and worthy of care. The body is not just a vessel to carry us through ambition, but a temple that must be respected. Imagine an old woman in her garden, her hands working the soil, her breath steady, her body still strong enough to move with purpose. She has never owned great riches, never built an empire, but she has nurtured herself, walked every day, eaten nourishing food, rested when needed, and now at 80, she moves with ease, savoring the simple joy of bending to smell a flower, of walking without pain, of being truly alive in her body. The lesson: health is not something to postpone. It is not a luxury. It is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, even the greatest fortune becomes meaningless. Start today, move your body, nourish it, honor it, because one day you will wake up and realize that health was the greatest wealth you ever had, and it was in your hands all along. 8. Relationships matter. More than achievements, people assume their loved ones will always be there. They push off meaningful moments, believing there will be plenty of time to reconnect. But by 70, many of those people are gone, and the words left unsaid become painful regrets. John had always been a man of ambition. From the time he was young, he believed that success was the ultimate measure of a life well lived. He built a career that others envied, working tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder. The promotions, the accolades, the financial stability, he had everything he thought he wanted. But in the pursuit of achievement, he sacrificed time with those who truly mattered. His wife Lisa used to wait up for him, hoping they could share dinner together. But work always came first. His children grew up seeing his absence more than his presence, learning to navigate life without their father's guidance. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings, assuming he was too busy, and he always was. There will be time, he told himself. Once I reach the next goal, I'll slow down. I'll make it up to them. But time is not something we can negotiate with. One evening, after decades of chasing success, John received a call that changed everything. His best friend, the one he had always meant to catch up with, had passed away unexpectedly. The weight of regret settled in his chest like a stone. He scrolled through his phone, realizing how many unanswered messages, how many missed opportunities, how many moments he had taken for granted. He went home that night and found Lisa sitting alone in the living room, reading. She looked up and smiled, tired but warm. He sat beside her, taking her hand, something he hadn't done in years. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And in that moment, he saw everything clearly. Buddhism teaches us the impermanence of life. Everything changes. The people we love will not be here forever. The moments we postpone may never come again. True wealth is not in status or possessions. It is in the connections we nurture, the love we share, the presence we offer. Imagine an elderly woman sitting at a quiet dinner table, looking at an empty chair where her husband once sat. She had spent years believing there would always be more time to say, "I love you," more time to take that trip together, more time to simply be. But time had moved forward, indifferent to her plans, leaving only memories and the ache of what could have been. John changed that night. He left work earlier, took his wife on long walks, called his children just to hear their voices, reconnected with friends over coffee instead of emails. He learned, perhaps too late, but not too late entirely, that achievements fade, but love remains. Let this be a reminder. The people in our lives are not guarantees. The love we give today is the only thing that truly lasts. Don't wait until it's too late to cherish what matters most. 9. True happiness comes from within. After a lifetime of chasing external sources of joy, money, recognition, material things, we finally understand that happiness was never out there. It was within us all along. Margaret had spent her entire life searching for happiness. In her youth, she believed it was tied to achievement, getting the best grades, securing a high-paying job, proving herself. Later, she thought happiness would come from possessions. Her dream house, luxury vacations, a wardrobe filled with expensive clothes. And when that didn't bring her peace, she looked for validation in the eyes of others, seeking approval from colleagues, friends, and even strangers on social media. But despite checking off all the boxes, Margaret often found herself lying awake at night, feeling an emptiness she couldn't explain. She told herself she should be happy. She had everything she had ever wanted, didn't she? And yet, a quiet voice inside her whispered that something was missing. One day, during a trip to Japan, She visited a small Buddhist monastery nestled in the mountains. The monks welcomed her warmly, their eyes filled with a serenity she had never known. She was curious. These men owned almost nothing, had no grand titles, no possessions of value, and yet they radiated a deep, unshakable joy. How? She spoke to one of the monks, asking what the secret was. He smiled and handed her a small cup of tea. "Drink," he said. She did. "Now tell me, did you enjoy it?" Margaret hesitated, confused by the simplicity of the question. "Yes," she said. "It was warm, soothing." The monk nodded. "You found joy in something so small, yet you've spent your whole life searching for happiness elsewhere. Why is that?" His words struck her like lightning. She realized that happiness had never been in the grand achievements or possessions. It had always been in the simple moments she had overlooked. The warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of an old friend, the feeling of her bare feet on the grass. She had been chasing an illusion when true joy had been available to her all along. Buddhism teaches us that happiness is not something to be acquired. It is something to be uncovered within ourselves. It is not in the things we own, but in the way we experience life. It is not in how others perceive us, but in how present we are in each moment. Imagine an old man sitting on a park bench, feeding the pigeons. He has no riches, no accolades, no social status. Yet as he watches the birds flutter around him, he smiles. A smile not of achievement, but of contentment. He has learned the greatest lesson of all. Happiness was never something to find, it was something to feel. Margaret returned home, changed. She started noticing the small joys, the taste of fresh coffee in the morning, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the embrace of a loved one, and slowly, the emptiness that once haunted her began to fade. She was no longer chasing happiness, she was living it. Happiness is not in the next promotion, the next house, the next milestone. It is in the here and now. Stop searching, start feeling, because everything you've been looking for is already within you. Conclusion: the gift of wisdom. Time is the greatest teacher, but it is also the most unforgiving. It moves forward, never pausing, never granting us a second chance to relive the moments we let slip through our fingers. By the time we reach 70, life has already whispered its greatest lessons, but the question is, do we have to wait that long to listen? What if we chose to see clearly now? What if we stopped chasing illusions and started embracing what truly matters? Love, connection, presence. These are the things that endure, long after titles fade and possessions lose their shine. Every second we spend worrying about things that don't truly bring us joy is a second stolen from what could have been a life well lived. So don't wait. Don't let regret be the final chapter of your story. Embrace these truths today. Laugh louder, love deeper, and be present in every moment. Because the only time that truly matters is the one we are living right now. If this message resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with those you love. And if you want more wisdom to guide you on this journey of life, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Let's walk this path together with clarity, purpose, and the courage to truly live.